Super Metroid was my first Metroid game. Back in the original episode, I told the story of how I bought it on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007, and it just clicked. It seemed as timeless then as it must have in 1994, as it still did in 2016. But that wasn't the whole story. This wasn't actually my first Metroid game. This was my first Metroid game. One of my cousins was quite a bit older than me. He got his start during the golden age of arcades. He grew up with an NES. Him and his teenage friends would make me play Street Fighter 2 and just absolutely wipe the floor with me. I thought he was the coolest. But he was older than me enough that he was part of that group where you were still sort of expected to grow out of video games once you got into high school, and he sort of did. So one day, he let me have one of his games. My cool teenage cousin gave me, a child, his copy of Super Metroid. I was obviously way out of my depth trying to play it. I never got anywhere in it. I might not have even started my own save file. All I remember is that every once in a while, I'd load up my cousin's save, which would drop me off right here, and the one thing I figured out how to do was this. Yeah, I'd pop this cartridge in just to do that. Blasting up and down the hallway. I thought it was awesome. Yeah, I've always been like this. And now you know the rest of the story. Given this season's focus on authenticity, my plan for this replay was to finally play Super Metroid on this cartridge. But if you have strange encyclopedic knowledge of videos I made almost a decade ago, you might know that the battery in this cart is long dead. So I took it to my favorite local retro shop, Two Dudes Gaming in Elizabethton, Tennessee. I love this place, highly recommend it if you're ever in the area. I told them I was going to say that, and they told me to tell you you can use Games for Geeks to get 15% off anything on their eBay storefront. So the dudes put a fresh battery in the cartridge, and it still didn't work. The game booted, but it wouldn't save. They gave it another shot, they kept the cartridge overnight, they tried everything they could to get her to work, but still nothing. I took this as a bit of a sign. Super Metroid is probably still the game I've played more than any other in the series. I haven't played it in quite a while, but I do still know it very well. Doing it again on real hardware would be great, but the difference would be merely sentimental. Maybe the universe was pointing me in another direction. I still wanted to use this cartridge as the base, so I dumped it to my computer and patched it with a ROM hack called Super Metroid REDUX. Oh yes, all those other episodes are me reduxing myself, but this one is about a game called Redux. It's an improvement mod that makes all kinds of quality of life tweaks to the game. I especially like how much faster room transitions are, but it also includes a few bigger changes. Chief among them is giving it a control scheme more reminiscent of the GBA games. Ordinarily in Super Metroid, you hit L and R to aim up and down respectively, and press select to cycle through alternate weapons and abilities. But in Redux, you hit L to aim diagonally, and use the control pad to switch direction. And while select still cycles weapons, you hold R to activate them. The X-ray visor gets its own dedicated button, the X button oddly enough, and its activation is much snappier and encompasses a wider area. And because I wanted this playthrough to be different, I chose to include just one of the optional patches. Heavy Physics. Super Metroid was the last game in the series to include Samus's traditional slow, floaty jump. This patch makes the physics more like the later games. Due to how deeply grained my muscle memory tends to be, I can be a bit of a purist when it comes to play control. Early 3D cameras? That's just part of playing the game, baby! I'm great at acclimating to unusual control schemes. I often find so-called jank to be part of the fun. I think playing side-scrollers in 4x3 gives you less time to react, and that's a good thing. And you can pry my low-frame wall jumping out of my cold, dead hands. I don't want Mario to slowly slide down the wall. I can react faster than that. This is so much crunchier, so much more satisfying. I'm playing this up for the sake of making a point. You should obviously play games the way that makes them the most fun for you. I'm just saying, this sort of thing really is often the most fun for me. And I've always been the same way about Super Metroid. I figured the control changes in the GBA games were compromises due to a lack of buttons, and I had no problem with the Super NES controls. I saw the floaty jump as being a little too sacred to change. And I say all this to impress upon you the significance of me saying this. I knew I was wrong before I even made it out of the first room. Even I've got to admit, Super Metroid really does feel a lot sharper this way. I shouldn't have knocked it before I tried it. Like, I gotta be real, guys, I love this game. You know I love this game. But at the same time, there are so many times I've come back to it after a break and found I left off at some point in Meridia. Actually, come with me for a sec. Let's take a field trip to the NSO app. And yep, right where I thought it'd be. But this time, playing in Redux? I wasn't running out of steam at all. I was going out of my way to look for secrets and finding things I'd never even seen before. One of the things I enjoy most about video games, to the point that it might be the key to the entire reason I love them so much, is that play control I talked about earlier. To go back to Mario 64 for a minute, when they were making this game, the very first thing they did, before they made any levels or assets or really anything else, the very first thing they did was make sure it was fun to play. Fun to move, leap, pivot, and exist within the 3D space. The easiest way to make sure your game sticks with me is to make sure that just being the character, just playing the game, is inherently fun. And in Super Metroid Redux, being Samus is a blast. It's actually a little too good to the point that it kind of breaks the game. Shinespark in particular charges much faster, but you know me. The joy of a video game is directly and proportionally correlated to how fast the character runs. Make him speedier and I'm gonna be happier, so it's hard to complain. That said, I wouldn't recommend the heavy physics to a first-time player. They make platforming a lot harder for starters, especially in a game where Samus does not have the power grip equipped. The room before the wrecked ship was a bit frustrating even for me, and while I don't think the physics enable you to break any sequences that can't also be broken in the vanilla game, having such tight air control does make some of them quite a bit easier. At least I think that's right. The truth is, I've been through Super Metroid so many times at this point, I don't even really know where the intended path is anymore. I don't know it like the back of my hand, but it's familiar enough, you know? The intended path is really just a suggestion, and that's one of the things I love so much about it. And through the process of actually playing the rest of the series, I found so much more to love about it. Like how connected it is to previous titles, how it revels in its lore and legacy in a way that games, especially Nintendo games, just didn't do in the 16-bit era. The first thing you do when you land on Zebes is make your way down to Torian, navigating down the same shaft that you, as a hypothetical young adult in 1994, might have climbed up as a child 8 years earlier. Seeing the burnt-out husk where Mother Brain used to be, you feel the passage, the divide between those times. This was totally lost on me back then. I lacked the experience and the context to appreciate it, but today, I do appreciate it. I've always thought of Super Metroid as the most memorable Metroid game. It does the whole invisible guiding hand thing better than any other exploration-focused game I've ever played. It's always the one I pick if I want to commit to a 2D Metroid. But it's not the one I've replayed the most since that original series of videos. And I've always thought that was because it was more of a commitment. But playing this reduxed version of Super Metroid now, I have to wonder if it wasn't also because the core gameplay mechanics of those later titles were just more kinetic and polished, even if their world design didn't quite have the depth or variability of Super's. I guess what I'm saying is that thanks to Redux, I can see myself coming back to it a lot more often. Super Metroid is still evergreen. It was an overlooked gem that became a cult classic, that became a legend. And its legend was critical in ensuring that the series would become legendary. Without Super Metroid, this franchise would have run the very real risk of meeting the same fate as Balloon Fight. Super Metroid is the reason Samus got into Smash Bros., the reason this series came back after that long 8-year gap from 1994 to 2002, the reason Metroid endured, survived, and thrived. There is nothing that I or anyone else could say that would take anything away from Super Metroid. But you know, sometimes there's nothing wrong with sprucing up an Evergreen.